In regard to David's talk, I was on the task force for Choosing Wisely and served the role of the old curmudgeon who was violently opposed to lay people telling us what to do in terms of what to order. So the fact that we held out for 3 years, I take some credit for that. But clearly I wasn't vindicated in his talk. Okay, yeah, just I hope I don't need it, but I'm going to hang on to it. Let me take you a little trip down memory lane. Oh, but before I do that, how many winners from last night? Okay, a couple out there. How many losers? How many no players? Okay, there's the smart ones right there. Let me take you down memory lane for a minute. In 1976, I got out of the Navy after my draft obligation and took a job with one of the first national contract groups based in St. Louis. And I took a job as Chief of Emergency Medicine at Methodist Hospital in Dallas and also the Regional Medical Director for them. The group, thank you, Rick. The group kind of taught me the business, and over the next 2 years I added 11 hospitals to their mix, contracting for staffing in the North Texas area. And then I made 2 grievous errors. One error was I asked to buy into the business, and of course they said no. And the second error was that since that was not a possibility, I was interested also in urgent care, and I tried to interest them in starting some urgent care centers. I said no. I went to the hospital administrator. He said yes, he would love to do that. And when I arrived at the office Monday morning, my key didn't work in the lock. So I subsequently spent approximately 9 months working out of town to avoid my non-compete while I tried to arrange an SBA loan to start a chain of urgent care centers. In the meantime, I wrote a letter to the editor in 1979 decrying the negative impact of contract management groups on our specialty. And my apologies to the nurses because this is more of a physician issue. About that time, there was arising an organization called the American Academy of Emergency Medicine, which took the position that the only legitimate emergency medicine group practice was a democratic one. And I define that to be a practice where each member, each full-time member of the practice has both an equal vote and an equal economic stake in the business. I'll modify that definition a little bit and say that you should have access to an equal ownership. The impression that's arisen is that you should be given that equal position, and I don't think that works. But I do think that everyone should have the opportunity to buy in equally. So AAM embraced my letter to the editor, and by the way, it's still there on the Annals website. For you non-members, you can get a copy for $31.50. I haven't seen any royalty checks yet, so feel free. I don't think I get any royalty checks. But at any rate, they embraced that as their manifesto, and that letter appeared on their website for at least the first decade of their existence. I don't think it's there any longer. In the meantime, I started to try to create a democratic group. And the first guy that expressed an interest in ownership was caught embezzling from the company. The second one sued me for breach of contract, alleging that I had verbally agreed to give him an equal ownership partnership. So what I found was actually creating a democratic group was a heck of a lot harder than what it looked to be. And so I kind of reassessed the letter. Gautama Buddha says the sharpest sword is a letter written in wrath, or a word written in wrath, and indeed it was. So I spent probably the next 5 or 6 years sort of retracting some of what I had to say in that letter, and in the process became kind of seen as an apologist for the large group contract concept. I think it's a wonderful ideal, but I don't think it's a valid business principle, and we'll go through why that is. The guy who actually got the key to the new lock is my consulting buddy, Robert Fielder. He's in the back row. Robert, raise your hand. And Robert spent some time with that same group, got disillusioned, left, and started a company called PSR. Neither of us have any interest in that company, haven't had for a decade. But the concept was professional practice managers assisting Democratic groups so that you had the physicians still in complete ownership and control, and the management was essentially a vendor who you could fire at will if they weren't doing their job. And so that model came to be an alternative. So I would modify probably the title of my talk to say the self-managed Democratic group. I do think that there are MSO alternatives out there where you can pair democratic equal ownership with professional management and have a successful practice. And in fact, a lot of those clients have grown dramatically, pretty much within a single healthcare system, but they've grown dramatically in their size and scope, as well as the buy-in. The amount that it costs to buy an equal ownership interest has increased. So let's talk about this, this business model of a democratic group where everyone has an equal vote regardless of what they know about the practice. This equal benefit imperative, I think, presumes that everybody will make an equal contribution to the group, and that never happens. Ideally, you would think, well, I could get these guys to serve on a hospital committee and those guys to work with EMS and this guy to be the medical director, but it never ends up being equal because the reality is we are not equal, either in our interests or in our aptitudes. Leadership and management in these groups is viewed as parasitic, and so they're restricted to the smallest amount of money possible. Good management, though, in my experience, again, looking at the MSO model, how does an MSO justify its existence to the physician group? A good, skilled, capable management should deliver 2.5 to 3 times what they cost. And if they don't, it won't be a long-term relationship. So that's a scale by which to measure that relationship. They also believe that it's fungible, which means that anybody can do it. So there are a lot of Democratic groups that pass the presidency or the medical directorship like a black bean. Every year, another guy does it, and that's an absolute formula for disaster because it really takes a career to build a capable leader, and by rotating it, you deprive them of that. Any disproportionate benefit, such as an administrative stipend for the medical director, is seen as unfair to the other members of the group, and so the groups often artificially create other administrative positions. You're the director of QA, and we'll give you a stipend equal to the medical directors. And what happens is the administrative dollars are eaten up by being spread around and not sufficiently focused to have one person do a good job of it. All expenditures typically require unanimous agreement. In a Democratic group, a vote of 9-1 is what? It's a tie, because that one guy can hold up everything in terms of moving ahead. Everyone has an equal vote regardless of their knowledge of the needs of the practice, which is really why you want your leadership concentrated in a smaller group, a executive committee, for example, to make those decisions, because they're the closest to what the practice actually needs. Also, the members feel entitled to challenge any decision that's made. When everybody's equal, everybody's in charge, and that means nobody's in charge. So a common scenario in my trying to help these groups would be so-and-so arrives 15 minutes late every shift. We're sick of it. We need to do something about it. Okay, we're going to pass a rule. If you're 0 to 15 minutes late, you forfeit the first 2 hours of compensation. If you're more than 15 minutes late, you forfeit the first 4 hours of compensation. Everybody agree? Unanimous around the room. The guy continues to be late. What he does is lobby his friends in the group, and they come back and rescind the rule. So actually nothing gets done. And also every expenditure is debated ad nauseum. The group's also typically financially hamstrung by the way it's structured. If you look at most practices run as a business, you've got practice income less billing cost. And I want you to kind of remember that number. I refer to that number as net after billing cost. And then you've got your physician expenses like malpractice and billing and compensation, and you end up with a net revenue. And then you have management, whose job is to maintain the status quo and cut costs where possible. And you have leadership that's to anticipate and manage change. And when they're done, there ought to be something left over, which is shareholder dollars to be divided amongst the ownership. Unfortunately, in the Democratic group, there's a difference of opinion about who owns this net revenue. It's not the practice's money, it's the individual's money. And so in a Democratic group, it feels like you're taking that money out of their wallet. Every time you spend $1 on administration, you're taking $1 out of my wallet. And so as a result, they would prefer for there to be 0 shareholder dollars, and in fact, there usually are. If you look at an emergency medicine practice, there are really 4 kinds of work. One's obviously clinical practice, leadership, management, and then ownership work. And we're going to concentrate a little bit on ownership work. There are 2 categories. Clinical practice is kind of different from the other 2. In clinical practice, it's inherently equal. If it's not equal, it's at least proportionate. If you're in a productivity-based practice, you're getting an equal proportion of your production. So there's not much differentiation between the individuals that isn't warranted. But in the other side, everything on that side is inherently unequal. People have an aptitude for leadership or not. People have an interest in serving on a hospital committee or not. And so you need to, I think, recognize those differences in people and not try to force them to be something that they aren't. If you look at leadership in the typical, well-run, what I call an impregnable small Democratic group, they spend 4 to 5% of their net after billing costs on leadership development, and reinvestment in the practice. It's not uncommon in a Democratic group to find that number less than 1%. And that spells future disaster for that group. Management is typically 6 to 7%, whether you hire an MSO company or you hire an MBA to run your practice, that's about what you're going to spend. So you get a total burden of 10 to 12% in leadership and management. The large groups can actually get down close to 8% on that number because you don't need 2 presidents of the group. You don't need 2 chief medical officers of the group. There's an efficiency of scale coupled with a volume discount purchasing aspect, such as participating in a risk retention pool as opposed to buying your malpractice on the open field. Ownership really, for most people in most groups, they're happy if they can get the lowest level of ownership, which is the guys that return phone calls, they answer texts and emails, and they come to the meetings. What percentage of guys in those groups would you guess that is? It's 85 to 90% of people reside in that group. They could care less about management of the practice as long as it doesn't impact them economically. But true ownership involves a whole lot of other things, including participating in projects that help anticipate and manage change, cover open shifts, take call, go the extra mile, serve on a hospital committee, and ultimately to look for a hospital executive position like a number of the medical leaders in these groups have done. They've moved on to VP Medical Affairs out of the group. And that's where things break down, is all of that needs to be done in a small group because the group really retains that contract based on relationships. So what determines whether a group like this gets a contract in the first place is the hospital's assessment of their likelihood of being able to perform. Now, 6 guys, equal owners, no designated practice manager, make a presentation before a hospital administrator. they're a long shot, to get that contract. First of all, they can't compete economically because of that 10 to 12 versus 8% difference. And clearly, a Team Health or an MCare or those folks have a track record of not failing in delivering a viable practice. So one of the things that the MSO model does is with the MSO sitting at the table, it reassures the hospital administrator that, yes, this group of physicians probably can perform. What determines whether the group keeps the contract? That is your leadership, management, and relationships, and how well you've met hospital expectations. So the small group can't compete on dollars, but it certainly can compete in these areas of leadership, management, and relationships. What's needed in most of these groups is some level of outside guidance, this is a list of the issues that you typically confront if you're a consultant going into one of these groups. The strategic planning is non-existent, so there's no way to hold people accountable for moving to where you want to go if they have never sat down around a table and discussed about what that is. Partner and client relationships are always in factions in these groups, and in order to help them work that out, you need to develop their communication abilities. And discipline is typically the largest deficiency in the group that has to be dealt with, is how do we hold an individual member accountable? But what's very typical is to have one member of the group, often the oldest member, who the hospital and the nurses all say, this guy can no longer handle the volume, he can no longer handle the workload, he's got to go, but the group doesn't have the will or the ability to terminate that physician. And the group actually ends up losing the contract over not making that move. We've got another talk we'll have a little bit later, but one of the points in that talk is never delay in making difficult decisions, because believe it or not, they don't only rarely get better with waiting, they almost always get worse. So the sooner you can intervene, the better. And then, of course, the EM group ownership and governance, what typically there should be is an ownership structure where you sit down and say, well, now the medical director can make these decisions up to this amount of money. The executive committee can make these decisions up to this amount of money. And what you want is for a small group of people to make most of the decisions, and then to have the whole group make certain key decisions. And those would be terminating a partner, adding a partner, taking on a new contract. Those would all be large issues that you'd want the whole group involved in, but not the day-to-day, how much are we going to spend on the Christmas party, and that sort of thing. Okay, but since the group's members see net revenue dollars as their money, and since they believe that all money spent on leadership and management have a negative return, proactive intervention is really rare. What's typical is the group ends up on the hot seat, ready to lose their contract, and they first play the medical staff card, which is they go to the medical staff and say, save me. Go to the administrator and tell him, that we're really a great group and we need to be here. And of course that puts him in a terrible position, and also with his board and other people. Next, they might put something in the newspaper to stir up public opinion about whether the group should go or not. But typically, it's too late to help that group turn itself around and provide the things that the hospital retained it to do. So for that reason, I think that that's the Achilles heel of the Democratic group, is that they don't know what they don't know, and by the time they know it, it's too late to fix it. So that's questions or comments. That's all I've got to present on this issue. Thoughts?
Any questions for Ron?
Yeah.
Do you think Democratic groups should be actively looking to try to get bought out by Team Health or Healthcare?
Should it be bought out by Team Healthcare? The question is, should a Democratic group seek to be bought out by Team Healthcare? I think this is a really important issue because we live in a day of emergency medicine group consolidation. And the truth of the matter is a large group has infinitely more muscle with the payers than does a small group, so that there's a significant economic benefit to everybody by aggregating together. You also monetize the value of the practice when you sell. In the good old days, we sold our emergency medicine group to MCare in 1996. We got an 8.5 multiple. That is that MCare paid us 8.5 times the annual profitability of the practice. So that what they were betting is that they could retain those contracts for 8.5 years or more to recover the cost of the purchase. We were 4 physician partners, and 2 of the partners actually went with the sale to assure that we hit those numbers. And in fact, we did hit the numbers and ultimately got the full sales price. But I think the reality is it's going to be increasingly difficult to maintain your position as a small independent group unless you're backed up by a significant MSO, and that you do need to think about the alternative called being merged into a larger practice. Yes?
With the consolidation in healthcare delivery systems, accountable care organizations, vertically integrated structures like Kaiser, why doesn't Kaiser go out and purchase emergency medicine services from the Team Health and the MCares of the world? Why are they different?
Why are Team Health winning the contract versus?
Kaiser.
Why doesn't Kaiser purchase emergency medicine services from outside entities, democratic entities or large group entities like Team Health?
Question is, why doesn't Kaiser purchase its emergency medicine services? I don't know. I'm not with Kaiser. Anybody with Kaiser? No. One of the things that the hospital does not anticipate, and Robert and I have seen this over and over again, is that the hospital believes that in order to control everybody in the negotiation for it with the payer, they've got to have them as employees. And so they push the physicians to become employed. They also want to take over the billing. And what happens is that the hospital is a very conservative coder. They code, they don't want an audit threatening the large inpatient cash flow stream. And they sure don't want an audit in the emergency department spilling over into that. So when the hospital takes over the billing, their coding moves from significantly right justified if you're doing the right thing as an emergency medicine group to significantly left justified. One hospital network that insisted on taking over the billing, and we tried to tell them about this, was paying no subsidy over 7 hospitals and just had to make the doctors employees. And they did, and the next year they were paying $1.5 million in subsidy. And they were paying it because of that difference in coding intensity. We, as physician groups, are pretty comfortable, and we've gotten pretty skilled at pushing the envelope on coding. And the hospitals just aren't willing to do that. And so it's not unheard of for them to then revert to making the group a private group again, or making some arrangement where some entity other than the hospital can take the liability of the coding.
Is there a subtext to your question, sir, in the back? You asked about why isn't Kaiser buying up emergency medicine contracts? Was there a subtext to it? Are you getting at, does Kaiser or Intermountain, actually he's not listening to me, are Kaiser and Intermountain, do they know something that we don't know? Was there subtext to your question, why isn't Kaiser buying up ER contracts, right? Why aren't they acquiring them? Was there a subtext to it that you're questioning?
The subtext was that if you've got a large organization that is interested in watching carefully utilization, with the emergency department is sort of the crossroads of inpatient, outpatient therapy, do they know something we don't? And is there a future for the independent emergency group? Is there a future for the Team Health of the world as the health systems organize into Kaiser-like structures across the country?
Yeah, actually, that's where I
Yeah.
thought you were going
Yeah.
with your question.
And I agree, that's what's driving consolidation, is that there is a future for that. And not only in emergency medicine, but it spills over into all house-based specialties for the most part, but it's probably go beyond that before we're done.
I think,
See, lady back here, and then I'll get you.
You talked about two models. You talked about the large MDs and the smaller single hospital democratic group. What do you see as the role of regional groups, emergency physician groups that are managing, say, anywhere between, say, 5 and 15 local or statewide emergency?
So the question kind of is, are regional groups viable? Yeah, I do think medicine is a regional business. And so regional groups of a sufficient size are probably viable and probably impregnable to the larger groups. If they've gotten large enough to be a regional group, they've already got pretty sophisticated management and IT and other things to back them up. Yes.
I would just, there is hope, I think, for the Democratic group. I mean, 4 years ago, we were under pressure to be employed by the hospital or to join Team Health, and we talked to about expanding into immediate cares, and the hospital system wanted us to come to their largest hospital. We were an 8 or 9 man and woman group, and we went there. In 6 months there, they asked us to take over 2 more of their hospitals that were there, and they had kind of a small regional group that was managing the 3 hospitals that really didn't have local physicians and weren't invested. And so they saw in us, the practice has been in existence for about 35 years now, and this was 4 years ago. So they saw in us, locally invested folks who did have a vested interest to be there and served on committees. And 2 of the members of the groups are now president of the hospital staffs of the 3 that we staff.
Right.
One is the Greater Medical Society for the metropolitan areas is the president. So you can get involved and you can impact this. And when you do have a good product, then you can spread into the system. And so it's about a 5 or 6 hospital system in our local area, and there's talk of us even taking on more.
He's talking about a small Democratic group that the hospital has asked to take on several additional hospitals and done well. The key to what you said is that the group's been in existence for 35 years. Relationships are what keep you in a contract and what deliver new opportunities when you're small. When you're big, you're competing on cost and the ability to deliver a practice in Timbuktu or wherever it is.
Ron,
Yeah.
would your advice be then, if you're small, especially if you're at just a single facility group, to look for opportunities to grow, to
Yeah.
at least become a smaller regional group for sustainability? Yeah.
Let's see, one more question.
As systems that you refer to do scale up and work together to become a state network or even a national network, wouldn't they want to work with a ER provider that's able to partner with them, and it's not a national provider that's providing ER care for every single hospital in the nation, and to a competing network that's across the street or across the state or takes half the state?
Yeah.
I would think a regional provider or somebody that's able to partner with the system or with anyone and say, we are your partner to develop models that are innovative to make you distinct compared to the other network across the state, across this state or...
Okay, he's describing a regional hospital system that partners with its emergency physician group and then tries to introduce that group to all of its hospitals.
EMP.
Could be a regional ER group or even a unique ER provider.
Okay.
Able to partner with the system instead of having a team health that provides that system and the system across town as well with the service.
Yeah, and there are plenty of examples of that. Tim C. is going to talk. He's got the head of a group in Houston that essentially partners with HCA to do all the Houston hospitals. By and large, the loyalty issue gets in the way of doing multiple hospital systems. And so if you're hooked up with a large hospital system, you've got lots of growth opportunity without them questioning your loyalty.